Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to The Secrets of Story Structure Part 4, The Inciting Event. The inciting event is one of the most crucial turning points in story structure. It can either make or break your narrative. Many writers, however, struggle with its intricacies and timing. Is the inciting event the initial brush with the main conflict? Is it a call to adventure met with refusal? Where does it belong in the structure of your story, particularly within the context of the first act? By analyzing examples from film and literature, we can unravel these complexities and learn to create an impactful inciting event. As the first major turning point in your story, the inciting event marks a transition from the setup in the first half of the first act into the build-up in the second half as the story begins to ramp into the character's full-on immersion in the conflict in the second act. As its name suggests, this is the event that incites or initiates the plot's main conflict. Also sometimes referred to as the inciting incident, this all-important beat signals that this is what the story is all about. For all that the inciting event is crucial to creating a functional plot, it is often misunderstood. My own understanding of the inciting event has evolved drastically over the years, and some of my own foggy ideas, as published in the first edition of Structuring Your Novel, have contributed to the confusion. I amended some of this when I offered my free ebook, 5 Secrets of Story Structure, as a supplement. But one of the main reasons I wanted to create an updated second edition of Structuring Your Novel and update this series was to share a more accurate and useful approach to the inciting event. The main thing that has changed about how I view the inciting event is that I no longer see its timing as flexible. I originally taught that the inciting event could take place just about anywhere in or before the first act. In that view, the inciting event might be an event in the character's backstory that motivates the main plot, or it might be the plot domino found in the first chapter, or it might take place halfway through the first act, or it might coincide with the door of no return, the first plot point, at the 25% mark. This wobbly structural timing was based on a conflation of several different important motivating events within the plot's timeline. When each of these events is given its own name, it becomes clear where the true inciting event really lands and what it actually is. So before going deeper, let's take a moment to properly identify each of these beats within the story. Starting with the motivating event in the protagonist's backstory. This is the ghost, also sometimes called the wound. The ghost is a term originated by John Truby, which I discuss in more detail in my book, Creating Character Arcs. As something that happens before the story, it is not properly a part of the plot structure. Rather, it creates context for why characters believe a limiting lie about themselves or their reality. This lie will then be challenged by the events of the main plot and will create the character's inner journey via their character arcs. Now let's think about what is the first plot domino in the first chapter. So as we discussed in part 2, this initiation of the story's cause and effect is created by the hook at the very beginning. And this beat functions to set up the story world and the characterizations that will lead to the true inciting event a few chapters later. That brings us to the turning point halfway through the first act. And here is where we find the true home of the inciting event, which we will explore in the rest of this episode. And after that comes the door of no return at the end of the first act. And this beat is the first plot point. It is one of the 3 most prominent turning points in the entire story, along with the second plot point or midpoint at the 50% mark and the third plot point at the 75% mark. In order for this beat to create a dramatic and irrevocable turn of events leading into the second act, it must be built upon a previous event that incites those events. So we will explore the first plot point in next week's post. So as we parse out the function and timing of these catalysts within the story, a clearer picture emerges of how the first act operates. This picture also supports the pattern of timing and pacing that creates an important turning point every eighth of the story. Now, some of you may notice I have not mentioned the key event in this lineup. In the first edition of Structuring Your Novel, I wrote, "The key event is the moment when the character becomes engaged by the inciting event. The key event is the glue that sticks the character to the impetus of the inciting event." And this was based on Sid Field's teaching in Screenplay about the two beats, where he says, the inciting incident sets the story in motion, while the key incident is what the story is about and draws the main character into the storyline. At the time, I also believed in a flexible timeline for the key event, associating it more with the inciting event than any other beat. I now associate the key event with the first plot point, something I also talk about in my book, Next Level Plot Structure. On the whole, I find it more straightforward to focus on the fixed beats of the inciting event and the first plot point. So I apologize for any confusion my own treatment of these terms has caused in the past. I hope this new information will clear up any perplexity. All right, now that we've explored what the inciting event isn't, what exactly is it? The inciting event is the turning point halfway through the first act. Up to now, the first act has mostly concerned itself with setup, with setting the stage, introducing the characters and their motivations, and indicating what is at stake for them. None of these introductions or the scenes they inhabit have been random. Each has been a domino knocking into the next, creating that flawless chain of cause and effect. However, up to this point, these scenes will not have particularly focused on what will become the main conflict in this story. Although the protagonist will have a desire in the first half of the first act, or at least a reason to desire something, this desire won't yet have solidified into a solid plot goal. For example, in The Hunger Games, Katniss spends the first half of the first act disliking the antagonistic capital and resisting them in small ways that ensure her family's survival. She has yet to form the specific goal that will directly engage her with that antagonist. Therefore, the story's main conflict has not yet begun. Rather, these early chapters lay the groundwork for that conflict. The inciting event is where the main conflict significantly intrudes upon the character's life. I like to say the inciting event is where the protagonist brushes the main conflict. This contrasts the full-on immersion in that conflict, which the character will experience at the first plot point. The difference is one of degree. Even if the happenings at the inciting event are quite radical, for example, Katniss volunteering as tribute to protect her little sister, they will not be as radical as what happens later at the first plot point, for example, having to start training as a tribute. The character's full engagement with the main conflict cannot happen until they form the main plot goal. That will happen at the first plot point and will signal the shift out of the first act into the second act. The inciting event exists to set up the first plot point. Because the plot goal will not yet be fully formed, the character's response to the inciting event will be uncalibrated and perhaps even uncertain. This brush with the antagonistic force knocks them off balance. In the hero's journey terminology, the inciting event carries the energy of what is known as the call to adventure. When we examine the archetypal underpinnings of story structure, we see that this is the moment when the characters are invited to step beyond a familiar comfort zone. They are challenged to push their growth edges, to step into a wider world, and to test their mettle. Aptly, the forward momentum of the call to adventure will almost always be met with a refusal of the call as the characters resist what their changing circumstances are now asking of them. In some stories, the protagonist will explicitly try to refuse the call to adventure by avoiding the consequences of the inciting event. In other stories, such as Hunger Games, the refusal may occur primarily within the protagonist, as represented by feelings of fear or inadequacies. And in still other stories, the refusal may be represented by counsel or resistance offered by supporting characters who do not want the protagonist to engage with the main conflict by enacting a specific plot goal. Officially, the inciting event splits the first act, taking place around the 12% mark in the story. However, this timing does not need to be exact. The shorter your story, the tighter your timing should be. The longer your story, the more wiggle room you have. However, the significance of the inciting event's timing is that it must allow enough space before to realistically set up whatever will happen at the inciting event, including what will motivate the characters to respond as they do. Most of the important elements need to be in place, or at least foreshadowed, by the time you reach the inciting event. The timing of your inciting event must also allow for the second half of the first act to focus on scenes that develop your characters' reactions to the inciting event. From here, the rest of the first act will shift out of setting things up into building up to the first plot point. Structurally, the first plot point is a massive moment in your story and will almost always be represented by a suitably dramatic event. The second half of the first act builds into that moment. Most importantly, this section of the story is where your characters will begin forming a concrete plot goal. In stories in which the characters are more reactionary, that is, they're at the mercy of a much larger antagonistic force, their plot goal may not become concrete until the first plot point. In these stories, the focus in the second half of the first act may be on increasing tension and raising the stakes, so the characters have little choice but to engage by the time they reach the first plot point. For example, in Star Wars: A New Hope, Luke Skywalker's inciting event introduces him to the opportunity of leaving Tatooine with Ben Kenobi, a call to adventure which he refuses, but when his aunt and uncle are murdered at the first plot point, he has no choice but to accompany Ben. Other stories will feature a more proactive protagonist whose desire for the goal creates the conflict rather than the conflict creating the goal. For example, in Bend It Like Beckham, protagonist Jess joins the soccer team not because anything forces her, but because it is her dream. And this puts her in conflict with her family, but she initiated the events. In stories like this, the protagonist often spends the scenes between the inciting event and the first plot point, taking deliberate steps toward a full commitment to the plot goal. In stories that feature particularly life-changing inciting events, such as The Hunger Games, the inciting event will still build up to the first plot point. Occasionally, in such stories, the first plot point will be less dramatic than the inciting event, but will still structurally function to fully engage the protagonist with the main plot goal. For example, even though Katniss's dramatic inciting event forever changes her life, she does not fully engage with the main plot conflict of surviving the Hunger Games until she reaches the capital, where she begins training as a tribute. In most stories, the three major plot points, first plot point, midpoint, and third plot point, will feature the story's biggest scenes. It's important to remember that even in stories in which this is not true, the structural timing and the specific roles of each structural beat remain the same. All right, so let's look at the inciting event in our chosen books and movies. Pride and Prejudice. Although Elizabeth and Darcy spar at the Meryton Assembly dance, forming opinions of each other they will spend the rest of the story trying to overcome, the true inciting event is the scene in which Elizabeth becomes the Bingleys' guest while her sister Jane is staying there as an invalid. This sequence brushes Elizabeth against the main plot conflict by initiating her relationship with Darcy. From here, their paths will become more and more intertwined. It's a Wonderful Life. This classic movie uses the entirety of its first act to leisurely introduce and build its characters. Its gentle inciting event occurs on the night of the high school dance, when George's father asks him if he would be willing to stay in Bedford Falls to help run the Bailey Brothers building and loan. George promptly refuses his father's request, and this sets up the central through line and George's central conflict between his need to stay and help, contrasted with his burning desire to leave Bedford Falls. Ender's Game. The first act frames the central conflict by introducing a world that has been under attack by the Formic aliens for over 80 years. The protagonist, young Ender, is not directly impacted by this larger conflict until the inciting event, when Colonel Graff and the International Fleet Selective Service recruit him. He is taken to battle school where he will be trained to outwit and outfight the aliens. And Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. This film's structure is interesting in that the inciting event sequence takes up almost the entirety of the first eighth of the movie. The sequence of scenes features the sneak attack by the enemy ship Acheron upon the protagonist ship HMS Surprise. After this attack, around the 12% mark, the protagonist must repair the ship and decide how to respond. Here are the top things to remember about the inciting event. Number 1, the inciting event takes place about halfway through the first act, around the 12% mark. The inciting event is the moment when the protagonist brushes into the main conflict, antagonist, or goal in a way that requires a response. The inciting event lays the foundation for the protagonist's subsequent full-on engagement with the main conflict. The inciting event is a call to adventure, challenging the character to either rise up in resistance against something or move proactively toward a desire. This call to adventure is initially refused, perhaps internally or perhaps by a proxy character, as the protagonist faces the weight of what is at stake in engaging with the conflict. And the inciting event signals the end of the first act's setup and the beginning of the build-up toward the second act. A solid inciting event creates the foundation for your entire story. Don't settle for anything less than the most powerful and memorable scene you can come up with. Time it strategically within the first act and use it to engage your readers just as irretrievably as you do your main character. Stay tuned. Next week we will talk about the first plot point. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the site and talk to me about this. Can you identify the inciting event in your work in progress? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.